So with preemption, so the idea of preemption is that when you have a conflict, say, between federal and state governments and federal and state law, the federal law in that case prevails. And discussions of preemption tend to focus on federal and state conflicts over law. But for as long as we've had those conflicts, we've also had conflicts between state and local governments. Those preemption conflicts have existed under the radar, and we'll discuss a little bit why we see preemption now as more of a national story rather than a local story. But what we've found in studying state and local preemption conflicts is that, for the most part, states win those conflicts. So in a lot of states, you'll have a conflict between state and local law. Courts have tended toward siding with states. And one of the arguments for that is used by courts in siding with states is that there's an effort to achieve uniformity in state law. And again, these were for a long time local and regional stories, and they focused a lot on policy issues that were either specific to a particular locality, or they were on an issue that wasn't particularly interesting at a national level, so where you had a number of states dealing with the issue at the same time. But it has grown into a national story over the last year for a few reasons. Preemption at the state and local level is a consequence of a growing partisan divide between local government and state government. So for cities, for example, you have mayors in 67 of the largest 100 cities based on population that are Democrats. On the other side of that, with states, you have Republicans controlling 69 of 99 state legislative chambers. They control 30 governor's offices. They have control over the governor's office and state legislative chambers in 23 states, what's referred to as a trifecta. So preemption is a consequence of that growing partisan divide. You have a greater clash between liberal and conservative ideas at the state and local level. And you also have, with state and local preemption battles that are going on right now, they are happening on multiple policy fronts of national interest, and they're happening within a very small window of time. So we cover on our preemption page 7 policy areas. We have 17 states with case studies. And in most of those cases, you see states winning those conflicts against local governments. And as is described, if you're seeing the screen, there's this paragraph here dealing with the idea of preemption. There is a really well-established legal tradition of court siding with states, something that's referred to as Dillon's Rule, which dates back to the 1860s. In a series of court cases, you have a Iowa Supreme Court Justice, John Dillon, ruling that cities and counties can really only pass laws that are allowed by state law, because cities and counties are sub-states of state governments. And that has continued on. So the US Supreme Court sort of fortified Dillon's Rule in decisions in the early 20th century, so that it really has been an important element of case law going forward. And you have different forms of preemption taking place. So, for example, in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in 2010, voters in Milwaukee approved a referendum that would have required paid sick leave. It was preempted by state law in 2011. So you had the residents of a city voting for a referendum, state legislature approving preemption of that particular policy area. In 2016, this year, in May, you have the Colorado Supreme Court ruling against Fort Collins and Longmont, in their efforts to regulate the fracking industry. And the Supreme Court in Colorado ruled against both of them because there was concern that the state had an interest in creating uniform regulations. And in a sort of interesting recent development, you have Arizona preempting local laws dealing with plastic bag regulations. And this is in fact part of a package of preemption laws that Arizona has passed recently to preempt local regulations. And in the case of Arizona, there is this conflict between local and state government that will likely continue on into the future because Arizona has not only passed a law that preempts plastic bag regulation by city governments and county governments, but you also have Arizona passing a law that took effect recently that allows any state legislator to request an attorney general's investigation into local laws that might conflict with state law. And the example that we have on our preemption overview page deals with Bisbee, Arizona, and this first use of this investigation, this law allowing state investigations into local laws. And Arizona is going to be interesting because they've also passed a number of other preemption laws to sort of get out ahead of cities on things like drone regulations. So Arizona will be sort of an interesting state to follow into the future. Now, how does this connect to elections? Well, the results of municipal and state legislative elections inform these conflicts. So going forward from 2016 on, do we see a further divide between municipal and state governments? So let's say of those 69 out of 99 state legislative chambers, do you see more of those go into Republican hands? Do you see more mayoral offices, city council seats, county board seats? Do those shift toward one side or the other? So if you see a widening of this, you may see more conflicts and more policy areas exist. Do we have a leveling off? So maybe we've sort of reached the peak point of preemption and it'll level off at a certain point because there'll be a reaction to the division between state and city government. And it's also important because preemption, like other consequences of elections, redistricting, for example, it is a multi-cycle story. So preemption isn't something that we can talk about with 2016 and then leave off to the side. It's something that will come up because you have municipal elections and state elections happening at different times. You have different numbers of seats up, so you may see the control over city council change over time, where you might also see the same thing happen with state legislative seats. So it's a multi-cycle story, and it'll be something that we'll be following at Ballotpedia. So I'll open up for any questions from anyone out there.
One question I would like to lead off with is, has there been any evidence that these attorney general investigations in Arizona are impacting voters and the way that the mindset that they have when they go to the polls in just a few weeks?
Yeah, it's relatively recent, the investigation and the use of that law. So the Bisbee bag regulation investigation, that's relatively fresh. So I'm not sure that there has been enough time necessarily for an impact on the current election. But it is something that could impact elections going forward because certainly mayors and city councils in Arizona are not thrilled about this because there are concerns that it is impacting the rights of, especially in Arizona, charter cities to have greater independence in terms of regulating certain parts of the law. So it's something that may not directly impact elections on a sort of a broad level this year, but it will likely in the future because you'll see further lawsuits and further clashes between local and state government.
Awesome. And then another question, I don't know how easy this would be to answer, but are there any cases where local governments are winning these preemption battles that they're having?
Yes. So So at the top of this page that I'm sharing, we mentioned that there are 15 resolved preemption cases, which means that for the most part, the preemption conflict has been litigated. There are 14 of those cases where states have preempted local ordinances or laws. The one example that I'm showing here is for Arkansas, where there was an effort by Fayetteville to change its civil rights protection ordinance to encompass LGBT rights. And there was a county court decision that said that the state law does not apply to this particular ordinance. Now, this was, I believe, more based on sort of maybe a technical element rather than a broader policy element. But this is an example of a local government winning one of these conflicts, at least for the time being. Yeah, your question's a good one because we don't have a lot of examples, at least based on the policy areas that we cover at Ballotpedia.
Cool. Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Cool. Well, if there are no more questions, we can let everyone get back to their day because we know everyone's very busy.